Good evening. My name is Ira Jackson. I am proud to serve as Dean of the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I am delighted to introduce and have us all acknowledge two of my predecessors, Ed Beard, the founder of the McCormack Institute, the predecessor institution, Ed, and Steve Crosby, the founding dean of the John W. McCormack Graduate School. Great to have you both back. So let me begin by acknowledging and thanking the Committee for the Robert C. Wood Visiting Professorship in Public and Urban Affairs for their service and for their great results in choosing Shirley Metzenbaum as this year's Bob Wood Visiting Professor. Bob Turner, the chair, Michael Ahn, Tim Blackman, Barbara Graceffa, Michael Johnson, Judith Curlin, and especially Peggy Wood. Would you all stand and accept our thanks, please? Excellent work, committee. We feel a special affinity with Bob Wood here at the John W. McCormack Graduate School. Bob, of course, was a visiting fellow at our predecessor institution, the McCormack Institute. We wouldn't be here tonight at this magnificent location surrounded by Boston Harbor if Bob Wood hadn't worked and fought hard as president of UMass to locate UMass Boston at Columbia Point. We wouldn't have as our neighbor the John F. Kennedy Library, and we wouldn't soon be welcoming the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the Study of the U.S. Senate if Bob Wood hadn't persuaded his friend Mrs. Onassis to relocate from Harvard Square and to help create a new beacon out here on the Point. Bob's courageous public and academic career, combining theory with practice, vision with action, is precisely what we want our students at the McCormack Graduate School to emulate and model for the future. John W. McCormack, for whom our school is named, grew up not far from here in Andrews Square in South Boston. As a boy, he scrounged the mud flats surrounding Columbia Point, looking for chunks of coal that had fallen off the barges so that he could heat the tenement house where he lived and where 4 of his siblings died from tuberculosis. In the 8th grade, he was forced to drop out of school to support his mother and the surviving siblings. He went on to become the second most powerful person in Washington. And as a congressman and as speaker, he helped to shape the America that we are so proud of today, an America with a strong tripod of governmental safeguards designed to ensure a degree of income security and dignity for every American: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We're so grateful for the example of these two great men, Bob Wood and John W. McCormack, whose actions continue to shape and guide the work of our school, both locally and globally. I think the tradition, it's my first year as dean, at this lecture is for the dean to talk about Bob Wood's life and legacy, but this year we found someone much better than the dean to do just that. Maggie Hassan, of course, is the governor of New Hampshire, the second woman elected to that position in the history of the state. She's the governor of the only state in the history of our nation to elect not only a woman governor, but also an all-women delegation to the U.S. Senate and House. Let's hear it for New Hampshire. And I've got a house in Vermont, so it's hard for me to say that. As a state senator, Maggie was a champion of universal kindergarten, sponsored the regional greenhouse gas initiative to reduce long-term energy costs, and was a leader in improving access to high-quality and affordable health care, including Connor's Law that required insurance companies to cover the cost of treating autism. As governor, she's promoted an Innovate New Hampshire jobs plan and has combined fiscal responsibility with a commitment to social justice and economic opportunity. More importantly, Maggie Hassan is Bob Wood's daughter. I can only imagine how proud he must be of her. Governor Maggie Hassan.
Thank you, Dean Jackson, for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here and to the McCormack Institute. Before we get started, just also just a moment of reflection on the last week that Boston and the region and the country have been through. I, like all of you, I grew up around here. The Marathon and Patriots Day is remarkably special to all of us, and what happened was horrible. But as I watched the Red Sox game on Saturday and saw the opening ceremonies, I found myself thinking, we were attacked, we responded, we took care of the injured, we mourned and continue to mourn the dead, we caught the suspects, and then we played ball. Bravo, Boston. And I also just want to give a special thanks to all of the law enforcement here in Massachusetts, and in fact some in New Hampshire, who came down to help for the work they've done over the last week. One of the things my dad taught me was that the first responsibility of government is public safety. And I am very impressed and very grateful to everyone who provides their public service by protecting the rest of us. Just a couple of quick things about my dad. For those of you who don't know, he grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, left his freshman year at Princeton, where he was in the first class of scholarship kids, to fight in World War II, survived the Battle of the Bulge, and I think came back from that experience absolutely determined to make his country a better place. And it was not unusual for us to be at the breakfast table and have Dad say, corny as it may sound now, what are you doing for freedom today? That's what drove him. He devoted his life as an academic, as a member of the first Kennedy administration and then Johnson administration, as a education leader at UMass and in the Boston public schools, and then back as a professor again, to understanding the intersection of theory and practice, understanding what's possible, but also what is it about us as human beings that limit our ability to implement the theories that we may come up with in the classroom. The intersection of policy and practice was critical to Dad as an academic, but I think it was even more important to him as a citizen. Because at the end of the day, what he always reminded us of, as we looked at that tension between citizen involvement in a citizen democracy and the need of managers and institutions to actually implement, was that our forefathers and foremothers really set a mission for us, which was to, generation by generation, bring people in from the margins, understand the difference between charity and justice, the latter being much harder than the former, and make sure that as each generation gained in understanding of the human condition, that we were bringing people in from the margins into the heart and soul of democracy, engaging every person's talent and energy, and as we did that, we all became stronger. That's the ultimate American mission. And it's an extraordinarily difficult one to implement and to live out. And for those of us in public life, it is an extraordinary but wonderful challenge. I have the best job on earth, being governor of the remarkable state of New Hampshire. I would not have it if I were not my father's daughter and my mother's daughter. And I will close with this before we hear from Shirley Metzenbaum, who I'm just so delighted you could join us and that you're here. New Hampshire has a tradition of having fourth graders come through the State House on their field trips. They study New Hampshire history and civics in the fourth grade. And it being New Hampshire, if the governor is in the State House when they come through, she goes out and talks to them, class by class. It's great fun. I spend a little bit of time talking with kids about what it is they like about school, what they like to study. And I ask them if it would surprise them to know that sometimes I don't understand all the memos and reading and reports I get. And they look at me and they go, really? And I say, yeah. And we talk a little bit about what you do when you don't understand something. And I finally say to them usually, you know, when Context clues are big in fourth grade, by the way. Everybody says you look for context clues when you don't understand something. But what I say to them, would it surprise you to know, boys and girls, that at the end of the day, when I really don't understand something or I need to sort something out, I call my mom. Well, I call my mom. So a special thank you not only to my dad, who taught me to love the human condition that makes politics the best job in the world, to understand that it is group decision-making at its most challenging and most difficult, but that it is the best and only alternative we have to violent confrontation and anarchy. I thank my dad for all the lessons he taught me, but I also thank my mom for those that she taught me. And at the end of the day, I also thank them both for remembering that we are all gathered here as academics, as many of you as intellectuals, but this enterprise we're all engaged in here is about whether a family in New Hampshire can find jobs so that they can have a safe house in a safe community, and they can have confidence that when they send their kid to school every day, that child is in a safe environment where they're going to learn and have the potential to work and lead. This is all about the people that we serve and represent, and my father reminded me and everyone else of that every day. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Governor. This evening for me is a double pleasure. I knew and respected and admired Bob Wood, and I went to school with Shirley Metzenbaum. Shirley has had a stellar Bob Wood-like career, a PhD from Harvard's Kennedy School, Associate Administrator of the EPA, Director of Capital Planning and Budgeting for the Commonwealth, now the Associate Director for Performance and Personnel Management at the White House Office of Management and Budget, our nation's Chief Performance Officer, responsible for making government deliver results with accountability and transparency. Like Maggie, Shirley is the daughter of a high-profile public leader, the late Howard Metzenbaum, and she shares similar traits: tenacity, conviction, courage, principled leadership. Shirley has been leaning in and making a difference all her life. It's a particular pleasure to welcome her back and home to the McCormack School, where Shirley served as the founding director of our Collins Center for Public Management. The Collins Center, which Shirley helped to create, is now implementing with Governor Deval Patrick the most comprehensive performance management plan of any state in the nation. In fact, the governor and the top 450 state agency heads and managers were in this same room last month for a full day of training to help make Massachusetts government achieve what we call mass results. Bob Wood got his start as a management organization expert within the U.S. Bureau of the Budget. Sounds like Shirley is picking up just where Bob left off. Richard Freeland, the state's Commissioner of Higher Education, once wrote about Bob Wood that he combined the intellectual's insights, the activist's values, and the politician's skills to advance the things he cared most about. It strikes me that Shirley Metzenbaum brings to her work of making government work leaner, smarter, and more effectively those same Bob Wood-like qualities. Please join me in welcoming Robert C. Wood, visiting professor Shirley Metzenbaum.
Thank you so much, Ira. And Governor, it's an honor to be here. Governor's family, Mrs. Peggy Wood and your Franny Wood, it's an honor to be here as the Wood Professor. To be able to deliver this speech in the name of a man who made so much difference in the world is just, it's awe-inspiring. And it's a bit challenging, I must admit, as well. It's also great to be back at UMass Boston, the McCormack School, and to be here with a group of people who care so much about making the world a better place. And then there is no place I would rather be today than in Boston. Boston strong, right? Massachusetts strong. We are here and we're here together. Our hearts go out to those who've lost someone. And our prayers go out to those who are in recovery. And our appreciation goes out to those who helped. There's so many folks from all over who just stepped forward and stepped in to help. Massachusetts showed its mettle. The country showed its mettle last week. And frankly, so did the government. And it just was marvelous to behold, even in the tragedy. What I'm here to talk about today is government. We saw government at its best last week. And it reminded us, government, that we need it. We need it, and we need it to work well. The events last week could not have been a more vivid reminder of this unassailable fact. As the president observed immediately following the bombing, police, firefighters, and first responders, as well as the National Guard, responded heroically and continue to do so as we speak. It's a reminder that so many Americans serve and sacrifice on our behalf every day, without regard to their own safety, in dangerous and difficult circumstances. And we salute all those who assisted in responding so quickly and professionally to this tragedy. I'm sure we all share this sentiment. We can debate when and where we need government and how we want it to work. But though few take the time to say it, when pressed, I know of no one who questions the need for government. The framers of the Constitution laid out their views about what we need our federal government to do. And it's worth taking a moment to reflect on that, on the depth and breadth of the purposes that they articulated. They wanted the federal government to establish justice. They wanted it to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And let's not forget, they wanted it to form a more perfect union. About 75 years later, about 150 years ago, almost to the day, President Lincoln reminded us, in defending that union, that we not only need government, but we want a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. Last week, government, working closely with the people of Massachusetts, the people in Massachusetts, and people around the world, worked, and it worked exceptionally well, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Just a few months ago, in his State of the Union, the president reminded us again of our relationship as individuals to our government. It's our unfinished task, he said, to make sure that this government works on behalf of the many and not just the few, that it encourages free enterprise, rewards individual initiative, and opens the door of opportunity to every child across this great nation. At the same time, he cautioned, the American people don't expect government to solve every problem, but they do expect us to put the nation's interests before party and to forge reasonable compromise where we can. For they know that America moves forward when we do so together, and that the responsibility of improving the union remains the task of us all. That's just the way we're made, he went on. As Americans, we all share the same proud title. We are citizens. It's a word that doesn't just describe our nationality or legal status. It describes the way we're made. It describes what we believe. It captures the enduring idea that this country only works when we accept certain obligations to one another and to future generations, that our rights are wrapped up in the rights of others, and that well into our third century as a nation, it remains the task of all of us as citizens of these United States to be the authors of the next great chapter of the American story. The President reminded us we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We ask a lot of our government. We ask it to defend us from our adversaries and bolster our economy. We ask it to keep our roads safe and our skies secure. We ask it to help young people to go to college and help others get jobs. We ask it to help seniors maintain a quality of life consistent with the dignity that every person is owed. And we ask it to keep our water and our air clean. The responsibilities of government are vast and they are varied. At the federal level, for example, the Department of the Interior is the largest supplier and manager of water in 17 states. It delivers irrigation to 31 million people and 1 out of every 5 Western farmers. It manages the lands that produce 30% of the nation's energy. And those are just a handful of the duties that the Department of Interior takes on. Every day, most Americans have ready access to food, energy, and roads. Community water systems, thanks to cooperative efforts by federal, state, and local governments, deliver clean, safe water to more than 300 million people. The Department of Transportation, working with state and local public safety officials, has worked together to bring fatalities on American roads down to their lowest number, not rate, but lowest number since 1949, even though the number of licensed drivers has more than tripled since then. Similarly, over 725 million passengers in the U.S. travel each year on roughly 10 million flights, with no fatal commercial accidents in over 4 years. School lunch program provides low-cost or free lunches to 31 million children each school day. Health and Human Services is bringing down the prevalence of diseases affecting our people who live here, while the USAID is helping to bring down the infant mortality rate around the world. NASA is exploring for signs of life on Mars, and at the same time beginning to stimulate private sector space exploration. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, its response to Hurricane Sandy, from across the political aisle, people were praising the work it did. And then, of course, we have seen crime fall to historic lows because the approach we are taking to policing, as we saw so vividly last week, has become smarter and smarter. Government is working. In doing all of these things that we ask of our government, it is largely successful. Still, we can't just rest on what we've already accomplished. It is time to figure out how to continue this effort. We need government to work well, and to improve continually. In short, we need government. We want a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And we want it to work on behalf of the many, but also to protect the rights of the few. And as we need our government to work well, because we ask it, as that list I gave you just demonstrated, we ask it to do so many things that are so important to the quality of our lives. With the fiscal constraints that we now face, this is more important than ever. As the President noted back in 2011, if we believe the government can make a difference in people's lives, we have the obligation to prove that it works by making government smarter and leaner and more effective. His statement neatly encapsulates the challenges facing all of us in government. But how do we perform better? At any time, but especially in times of such tight fiscal constraints. How do we motivate continuous improvement when we lack the competitive pressures the private sector has for individual organizations to get better and better? How do we do that in a climate where, quite frankly, there is a bias toward talking about negative things regarding government? So what I want to do a little bit is explain to you the approach we took in the Obama administration, what we are doing, an approach that is now set in the law. I want to talk to you about the progress we've made, the challenges we've encountered, and then I want to talk about next steps and challenges and turn to the panel and let them figure that out. We are committed in the Obama administration to deliver high quality and ever improving services to the American people. And so we started our effort by mandating a few practices based on our review of the best available evidence of effective management practices in the public and private sector. We focused on 3 practices based on looking at work here on the Charles River, the New York City Policing Department, what was happening in the United Kingdom, what was happening in New Zealand. We looked everywhere. Best practices in the private sector. And then, of course, all these stat meetings that are going on all over there. That's short for statistics, for those of you who don't know what a stat meeting is. These data-driven reviews started with New York City Policing with CompStat for computerized statistics. And we looked at all of these things, and we tried to apply what we learned from all of them to a scale and scope that I'm not sure has ever been tried before. What are these practices? Well, they're actually so simple and intuitive that people don't even believe that you weren't doing them already. Setting goals, measuring progress, using the data to ask questions, run and manage with, and then communicating what you're doing. These practices are so simple and intuitive that many outside government ask, you mean you didn't already do that? And let me be truthful. Agencies, the federal agencies for sure, in fact, already did set goals, and they measured performance, but they only did so once a year. Too many used their performance goals and the data they've collected primarily to report once a year in annual performance plans and annual performance reports that they were required by Congress to prepare. And they put them there, and they posted them online because the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, where I work, said, please make sure that you post these online. But, oh, that was I won't make the reference. When we looked at it, we realized too few were actually using the goals and the measures. We started talking about using a little mantra, useful, useful, useful. If you're not using it, it's useless. We really wanted agencies to use the goals and measures. What do we want them to use it for? Well, there's a temptation, folks think, is, okay, we want to see if you met your goals, and if you didn't, are we going to punish you? Are we going to link penalties? So we're going to use it as an incentive system and do a very simple linking goals and measures to punishment and rewards. But we had another idea. We wanted agencies to use the goals and measures to manage. We wanted them to communicate what they were trying to accomplish and how well it was working. We wanted them to use the goals and measures to motivate change, to inspire innovation, to illuminate the problems and opportunities they could pursue, to share lessons learned, to support cooperation on shared goals, and then to enlist ideas, expertise, information, and assistance. Goals and measures are powerful tools that way, and we aim to reset the mindset. We wanted agencies to use these goals and measures to improve government's beneficial impact on the communities and to communicate what government's trying to accomplish and how well it's working, and to engage the community of the people, by the people, for the people in those conversations. So how do we do this? How do we reset the mindset? In the first year of the president's term, the president asked all the cabinet members and heads of 8 other large agencies like the Social Security Administration to set a few specific, ambitious, outcome-focused goals. Okay, not so hard. Set a few specific, ambitious, outcome-focused goals. Why do we do that? Well, we wanted them to be specific, which means indicating how much of what do you want to accomplish by when. We wanted them to be specific because when they're specific, it's a remarkably low-cost, easy way, a shorthand of communicating to the public what is it we're trying to accomplish. And by omission, what we're not trying to accomplish. It is saying, what are we focusing on? It strengthens democratic accountability. We wanted them to be outcome-focused. Outcomes, what do I mean by outcomes? The things that matter in people's lives. So the quality of the water, is it swimmable? Is the water swimmable? You know, Are kids graduating from school? How healthy are people? Rather than how many activities, how many permits were issued, or how many plans were completed. We wanted them to focus on outcomes because that keeps agencies asking if their actions are having the intended impact. And if they're not, starting to say, well, if it's not, what do I need to do differently? So that was one of the revolutions in community policing, which was when the New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton said, we are going to focus on reducing the crime rate. And the cops said, we don't control the crime rate. Well, it's true. There's a whole lot in government we don't control, but we can influence it. And when you start focusing on those outcomes, whether it's the crime rate or the number of kids graduating from high school or teen pregnancies or the quality of the water, when you focus on those outcomes, it brings forward a whole bunch of different questions. It gets your brain thinking and your strategies moving forward in a completely different way. So we wanted agency heads to choose goals that were focused on outcomes. And we wanted ambitious goals, so specific goals, outcome-focused goals, and ambitious goals, stretch targets. Why? Because if you set a stretch target, something you couldn't meet using your existing practices, it forces innovation. It forces you to think about what else could we do? How could we do this differently? Is there a smarter way to do this? And that energizes people, but it also gets them to think about lower-cost ways to accomplish more. So we wanted specific, ambitious, and outcome-focused goals. The research actually on the power of specific, ambitious, outcome-focused goals is remarkably robust. Whether you're talking about in the laboratory or you're looking at experience of large organizations, they work, provided that you're not asking the heads of these organizations at all levels of the organization. It can be a regional office, it can be a subunit of regional office, and it can be a very large federal cabinet level department. It really works provided you're not picking so many goals that people are overwhelmed by it, so that it's really manageable, so you can see how you're going to get at it and you can think about it. You're not overwhelmed by the size of the task. I should also mention that when we asked the cabinet members to set these priority goals, we said to them, we don't want goals that require legislation or significant amounts of new funding to accomplish. Why do we do that? Well, you know, folks who come to Washington come in a lot because they want to get engaged in the policy debates, and that's great. That's really important. They also come in and want to get engaged in the budget debates. And in truth, the people who come in and head up these departments end up doing crisis response a whole lot of their time. And that could consume all of their time. And that is hoping they get out and give speeches about what the policies actually are. But how do you get them to focus on implementation? That's why we said we want these priority goals to be 2 years, 2-year goals, because it can't be after you're gone. We want you to be accountable for getting it done. And we said, this should not be dependent on new legislation or new funding. That is not to say your longer-term goals, other goals can't be dependent on those, but we want your priority goals to focus on things where you and your attention and your organization need to deliver. So 24 agencies have now set 103 priority goals. There are also 14 cross-agency priority goals, federal priority goals. And these reflect areas where the president has established priorities and cross-agency action is needed. Goals that aim to secure our future, strengthen our current economy, and take care of our returning servicemen and women. So they're goals like doubling exports by the end of 2014, cutting energy uses 50% by 2035, or expanding broadband coverage to at least 98% of Americans by the end of 2016. These goals are not all the CAP goals, as we call them, cross-agency priority goals. They don't constitute all the president's priorities. We picked these goals because we knew setting a goal and having a goal leader would make a huge difference in accelerating progress. So that one of the practices, very simple, set goals. But it's not enough to set a goal. You got to measure progress. If you set goals and you don't measure progress, then the goals are just words. So you've got to measure progress to know if you're making a difference. The goals can excite allies, they can energize action, but you need a mechanism, whether it is measurements, it's milestones, it's evaluations. You need mechanisms to say, is what we're doing working? Measurements of progress are much better when they're frequent. Because if you don't measure frequently enough, then you're hoping you're making a difference, but in fact, you may not be making a difference. So we asked agencies on their priority goals to measure at least once a quarter. That kind of measurement, measuring more frequently, saves time and money. And it saves time and money because you get faster feedback. And if you don't get the faster feedback, then you may keep doing what you think is working when in fact it's not. So if you can get the faster feedback, it's good to get it. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, so you can probably tell this story better than I am, but I'm going to tell the story of the Charles River because it's such a vivid illustration. It's a basis for what we've learned. Back in 1995, the regional administrator of the Charles River set a goal that the Charles River would be swimmable in 10 years, a guy named John DeVillers. Some of you may know him. And basically, he set that goal on the eve of the head of the Charles Regatta because there was a lot of media attention. So it's a great time to set a goal, to worry about the quality of the water. Once he set the goal, the question, of course, is you want it to be swimmable in 10 years. How close to swimmable is it now? So you've got to go find the measurements to figure out if it's swimmable or not. Well, it turns out the state gathered the water quality data once every 5 years. And then they did a plan, and by the time you look at it, you're not sure if you're looking at relevant data or not. But fortunately, the Charles River Watershed Association had sent a team of volunteers out, and they had started just a few months earlier measuring water quality for two conditions, fecal coliform and dissolved oxygen. They were doing 37 points along the 80-mile stretch of the river. They were measuring once a month and posting it online, on a spreadsheet online. Not very fancy, but the EPA folks figured out, there's data there. We can use the data. And they started to look at the data, and they did very, very sophisticated analysis. They looked for where there was a downstream site that had a worse reading than an upstream site. It's very complicated, right? And when they saw that, they basically looked and said, what's going on in between? Is there a permitted facility that's discharging pollutants into the river that might explain that worse condition? When they ran into some situations where they couldn't explain why the downstream site had a worse reading than the upstream site, they called the local government, including, in one case, Boston Water and Sewer Commission. And Boston Water and Sewer said, we don't know. So notice, again, the very sophisticated methodology here. Look at the numbers, which one's lower than the other one, or higher, and then pick up the phone and make a phone call to figure out why. And Boston Water and Sewer Commission said, we don't know why that's a worse reading. So they said, why don't you grab your maps? Let's go walk the pipes. So they went and they walked the pipes, and they found an illegal hookup to the sewer system. Now, to the storm sewer system, right? It should have been going into the sanitary sewer system and going down and getting treated, but it wasn't going there. Now, in fact, rowers had rowed along the river and seen gunky stuff coming out of the pipes and called and complained, but EPA never paid attention to it because they didn't think it was important enough. It wouldn't have been a big enough enforcement action. They just ignored it. But once you set the goal that the Charles River would be swimmable, you paid attention to it. And so they realized, wow, wonder if there are other illegal hookups to the storm sewer system. Somebody said, what if on a dry day we lift the manhole covers over the storm sewers and look for running water? Because there shouldn't be any when it's not raining. And so that's what they did. And it then triggered a whole bunch of letters to local governments in Massachusetts to basically say, would you please look for illicit hookups? And the water quality went from being swimmable 19% of the time to being swimmable 59% of the time 5 years later. And this was, for the experts had all said, we've gotten rid of all the non-point sources, that's not a problem. They had assumed they knew that what they were doing was working. And instead, what they really needed to do was look at the data. Now, you might ask, did they make it? Is it swimmable? Did they get it swimmable in 10 years? And the answer is no, they didn't make it. They didn't meet the goal. What's kind of interesting is, I think it's 3 or 4 regional administrators and 2 or 3 presidents later, the goal is still, if you Google EPA, Charles River cleanup, you'll find it, and you'll find a report card for every year since 1995. And you will find the percentage of the time that the water is swimmable and the percentage of the time that is boatable. I did that before I came here, and I will say, here's what EPA writes. The end result of our work since 1995, a river that is safe for recreational boating virtually all of the time, a river that is now a resource for an active windsurfing community, a river that is safe for swimming so much of the time that there's now an organization actively promoting an annual swim race. Indeed, we are much closer to the original goals of making the Charles both fishable and swimmable. It's so simple, so powerful, if in fact you set the goals, you measure, you look at the data, you ask questions, and you manage. When measurement or other means of marking data are done annually or even less, it should raise a warning flag to us all that the measurement is being used to fill out a report rather than to improve outcomes or find lower ways to achieve the same objective. Now, I will admit that people worry about the cost of measurement, and it is definitely not costless. Still, it's far more affordable and feasible today than ever before. And consider the risk of the alternative. Measuring once a year, or even less frequently, as was previously done on the Charles, risks the continuation of ineffective or less cost-effective practices. And it misses opportunities to encourage the kind of innovative thinking that can get real change in real time far sooner than people expected. Based on this Charles River experience and other experiences like that of the New York City Police Department, we decided to require federal agencies to measure priority goals at least once a quarter, a major departure from past practice. We make them collect performance indicators at least quarterly. When they don't have performance indicators, as with the Mars landing, it's milestones. We ask them to report on milestones every quarter. And we want them to look at their data and review the data on a quarterly basis. But we tell them it's not only the performance indicators you may be looking at, there may be a suite of indicators that you want to be measuring. So we're trying to get agencies thinking of moving away from thinking about there's just one number I need to keep my eye on, when in fact there's a whole set of numbers. So for example, in New York City policing, they worried about was police abuse going up. So they also looked at police abuse, the unwanted side effects. In other cases, in the Federal Aviation Administration looks at what they call tarmac incursions, precursor indicators to things that might become a problem down the road. So there's a whole bunch of other indicators that agencies are learning to collect and that they're starting to collect. Goals without measurement, they don't mean very much. They're just words on a page. But the same can be said about measurements that are collected but not used to inform action. Useful, useful, useful. If you're not using it, it's useless, right? We wanted to transform prior practice where agencies use the goals and measures for reporting and planning and get them to use it to illuminate the smartest path forward. So we did mandate a number of practices regarding use. First, we required the number 2 person in the organization, the deputy secretary or equivalent, to run quarterly data-driven reviews. Second, we instructed each agency to have a performance improvement officer who staffed those quarterly reviews and did the analytics in advance, not to do the gotcha kind of conversations, but to ask the right questions, the smart questions. And we asked them, the performance improvement officer is supposed to follow up on that as well. So we have a bunch of it, all agencies are doing this. Actually, all of the agencies have now begun to do this. And they also have created a working group so that people who run these quarterly performance reviews are meeting with each other and visiting each other's quarterly performance reviews to learn from each other's methods. What are they doing? They're experimenting. Housing and Urban Development has actually taken its senior executives who are not specialists in the field and bring them in to ask questions. So there's a lot of experimentation going on that's quite interesting. So the first thing we required a chief operating officer, the deputy secretary or equivalent. We required a performance improvement officer, and then we required the agency head or the deputy secretary to name a goal leader. So when the EPA essentially established the Charles River goal, they named a single person, not full-time, mind you, but they named a single person who was responsible for managing progress on that goal. He tapped 2 other part-time engineers. So it was a lawyer and 2 engineers, and all of them were working part-time on it. When New York City started to deal with trying to bring the crime rate down, they named precinct captains. They made the precinct captains stand up and talk at the CompStat meetings because they were the accountable official. They needed to know what was going on in crime in their district. And we said to agencies, for every one of those 103 priority goals, you need to name a goal leader. So you had accountability. But we asked them not to run those data-driven reviews as gotcha sessions, but rather as continuous improvement, pushing for how do you get better, how do you get smarter. So those are 3 of the practices we encouraged for use. And I will show you in a second how you find out about those goal leaders, these goal leaders who are accountable. But there's a 4th practice we asked agencies to adopt, and that was communication. We asked them to communicate the progress on their goals, what their goals are, why they chose them, the strategies they were going to use to try and influence them, and then to communicate progress every quarter and what they plan to do next, as well as the different programs around the federal government who needed to contribute to the goal. That's what we asked them to communicate on this website you see up here, performance.gov. We also asked them to do other kinds of communications because we realized not everybody who needs to be influencing outcomes, who could influence outcomes, what we call delivery partners, we realized that not all the delivery partners are going to go read performance.gov. This is not really designed for delivery partners. This is designed as a tool to help us move performance forward, performance improvement forward. But we wanted them to think about who else needs performance data. So we've asked agencies to think about audience-focused information. Who needs to get what information by when so they can make smarter decisions? So in the case of the Charles River, what you have is the Charles River and the boating houses are putting red and blue flags up. Because who needs to know if the river's clean? The boaters, to know if it's safe enough to go, and they need it in real time. So we want folks, it's the same in terms of schooling. What do you want the teachers to know? What do you want the superintendents to know? What do you want the parents to know? How do you package information, performance information, so it can inform the decisions that people need to make on a timely basis? We're urging agencies to think about audience-focused information. Performance.gov is one part of that mechanism, and I'll walk you through it in a second. But it's only one of them. We really want agency heads. We really want agencies to think about who their delivery partners are, and also, in the case of parents, who needs to make choices informed by performance data. And then how do you get that information to them on a timely basis? And how do you know if they understand what they're getting? That's part of the delivery chain. It's part of implementation. So, what we're finding is when agencies think strategically about the audience, you really get some big change. So how is all this working? I'm going to let you look for yourself. But our sense is it's all working remarkably well. Exports are on track to double by the end of 2014. 81% of Americans have access to advanced wireless broadband, up from 36% in 2010. When wired connections are included, availability jumps to almost 96%. Since 2009, over 1.2 million homes, mostly of low-income people, have been retrofitted with savings of between $250 and $400 a home. As a result, 3 million metric tons of greenhouse gases are no longer going into the air each year. But I'm going to say to you, don't take my word for it. Go check out performance.gov. Let me take you through the Department of Interior, 2 goals it has, and give you a sense of how we're trying to do this. So as you see, you've got performance.gov, and if you look at the areas of focus, you can go to performance improvement. You can also learn a lot about all these other areas, all the technology spending we're doing, all the human resources, our hiring times, the percentage, the numbers of people by occupation who stay for 2 years in different agencies. You can see a lot of that information. But if you go into performance improvement, you get to the clear goals. And you get to a tab that looks like this, that says clear goals. And you can scroll down there and you can narrow the goals by agency priority goals, those 100 goals, or you can actually go to strategic goals and objectives if you want to see an agency's strategic goals and objectives. And then you can pick an agency, or you can actually pick a theme. And so here you are, you're seeing all of our priority goals. And let's go to the ones for the Department of the Interior. So here are the goals for the Department of the Interior. And you'll see that all the priority goals are listed. And I'll just take you down here, I'm sorry. Here's all the priority goals listed, and you can click on these left arrows, and you can see a description. So here's the one about renewable energy and wanting to do renewable energy. And I will tell you, if you look at this description here, way too long, looks terrible on the website, we know, we got to fix it. This is part of the science of figuring out how you communicate. But if you scroll down here, you'll go to the Learn More button, and if you click on it, it will take you to what we call the goal homepage. So you heard me talking about the goal leader. We put the goal leader's picture there. We learned that from the New York City Police Department, where they put the precinct captain's picture, and you can actually go and see their data, their overtime data, their arrest data, et cetera. On the first tab, on the goal overview, you'll see the goal overview and the strategies. Why did they pick this goal? What strategies are they using? We then ask the goal leader every quarter to report to the public the progress they made in the most recent quarter. The next steps is what are you planning to do? What are your milestones for your next quarter, for the current quarter and next quarter? And then the future actions is what are you trying to do before the end of 2013 in order to make sure you make this goal? Now, in this particular case, they put together a strategy, and in their overview, you actually see this Learn More button because they're providing you with much more detail. They're telling you about their active projects here. And you can actually go in and see what projects they're trying to pursue. So this is government that's being pretty transparent. What are we trying to accomplish? How are we trying to do it? How is it working? These are milestones. You can go on back here to then also the indicator list, which will show you, oops, sorry, wrong. I'll go here. So I can go to the indicator list, and it shows me the improved capacity authorized. Now, I kind of love this goal because it illustrates innovation and problems. They set a goal in 2011 that they were going to hit 9,000 megawatts of renewable energy authorized. This is essentially permits approved for private sector to build on or crossing interior land. And you saw that list of permits that are being issued. And if you see, you'll notice from September 9th to September 10th, they're struggling. They cannot figure out how they're going to make this goal, right? They have to figure out how to do environmental impact statements that are actually environmentally responsible at a speedier level than they're doing them. And they figured it out, as you can start to see in December 10th. Now, September 11th, that bar is actually the end of the fiscal year. They only hit 6,000 megawatts in that year. Didn't meet their 9,000 megawatt 2011 goal. Now, should we have punished them? We didn't, because in fact, in the prior 30 years, they'd only permitted 1,500 megawatts. They hadn't really had a goal on this, and they'd made so much progress. This was about progress. We're focusing on trends. Are you trending in the right direction? And now take a look at it. They want to get to 11,000, I think their goal is 11,000 megawatts by the end of 2013, and lo and behold, by the end of December 2012, they're at 10,900 megawatts. So what you have here is an organization that's really learned how to bring about change. They've also picked another interesting goal. So this is, for us, the power of a goal. Here's another interesting goal, a very different goal. Department of Interior again, we want to reduce the crime rate on Indian reservations. We can't do it all. We have to get specific. We can't make it overly ambitious. We can't try and reduce the crime rate everywhere because we don't even know how to reduce the crime rate on Indian reservations. So we're going to focus on 4 reservations with high rates of violent crime. And we are going to try and reduce the crime rate on 4 reservations with high rates of violent crime. And the first thing they did was they had to figure out how to measure the violent crime. So they actually sent the tribal members of the tribal community to the FBI and trained them in how do you use the uniform code of, what is it, USERA or something, the Uniform Crime Code. and they trained them in the Uniform Crime Code. Well, a kind of cool thing happened along the way, which was they were all hanging out in DC getting trained on this, and they had all this downtime, so they started to talk to each other about how do we actually, what are we going to do when we get back there? So there are 4 reservations where they're trying to bring violent crime down, and they give you the goal overview, the strategies, they've named the reservations. And in the first 2 years, by the end of 2011, they had reduced the violent crime rate on those 4 Indian reservations an average of 35%, even though the goal was only a 5% reduction. They didn't know how they were going to do it. They reduced it 35%. Truth of the matter is, though, they only reduced it on 3 of the 4 reservations, 35%, or more than 35%. On one of them, it went the wrong direction. They had to figure out how to deal with that. So they just went in and they worked with that reservation. They also, it was basically, they were managing, they created a database so that the tribal communities could use the database. They had conversations, weekly meetings to figure out, weekly phone calls, what can we do to make it work better? And by the end of 2012, they have been brought down, a year later, it's down 55% on all reservations. Now, you may ask me, how is it working, individually? I'll take you back to that in a second. But what you also see is they decided for next year they were going to they were adding 2 more reservations. And on those 2 additional reservations with high violent crime, some of which are run by have tribal police versus BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs Police, they're having a dickens of a time. The crime rate's gone up 20%. Part of that may be because people are reporting more. They don't know what the reason is. They know they've lost, they don't have a police chief on one of the tribes, so they got to hire a really good police chief. They're just trying to figure out how to deal with that. And if you go to their progress and next steps, they start to explain this. Beyond that, they know they can't get everywhere at once, so they've actually looked at their experience, and they're trying to help other tribes. And if you go here, you actually get a document that helps that other tribes, they're sharing the lessons learned. So we're trying to create this healthy dynamic, and here you get this great conversation. This is the individual tribes, and what you're looking at is monthly data year by year that you can actually see whether this is working or not. So we think it's working. We think that this method and message is really working. We think the power tools of goals and measurement, data-driven reviews, and communication, we think they're working. But what's next? Well, that's the challenge I think we all face together, right? Let me tell you what I think one of the biggest challenges is. I think one of the biggest challenges is how do we get the incentive structure for good government to work? And that's in a system in which, in the private sector, you would have a lot of pressure from investors to report on what's working well in business. We don't have that same pressure in the government. There's not the same pressure to report what works well. It's only to report what works badly. There's a bias to the negative. Secondly, you don't have the threat of going out of business. So the question is, how do we, in a world in which very sensibly the newspaper is not going to report on, or the multimedia writers that there are, they're not likely to report that all the planes landed safely at Logan today, right? They're going to report if there's a problem. How do we get people to pay attention to the fact that this government that we've got is basically working marvelously well? How do we get them to remember that after they've gotten a service that was helpful to them, that it was government that was helpful to them, so they want to support government. They want government to work, and they're willing to give it the financial support, but also engage with it to make sure they're focusing on the right things most of the time. I think that's one of our biggest problems. I think our other challenges is actually figuring out how to make the mechanisms of performance management, measurement and management work. There's this tendency to always think that if you're doing performance, you ought to link it to goals and measures and rewards and penalties. But if you didn't hear me talk about rewards and penalties at all. I talked about goals, measurement, using the data, and communicating it. But sure, incentives work. When and how do they work? How do you do performance-based grants? How do you do performance-based contracting? How do you make it work well so that people aren't afraid of being penalized? Do we use Bill Bratton's approach? Bill Bratton, again, the New York City Police Commissioner, who said, nobody got in trouble if the crime rate went up. They got in trouble if they didn't know why it had gone up and they didn't have a plan to deal with it. Does that mean we should never link goal attainment to rewards or penalties, but only link it to whether or not you're paying attention to the data and managing it? It's a lot more squishy. It's a lot less satisfying. How do we deal with that? So we need to figure out how to make incentives work. We need to figure out smarter ways to measure. So we've got good ways, and we need to share good measurement methods. So we know how to do queue management and inventory management from the private sector. How do we get the public sector in looking at permits and looking at claims and looking at, benefits requests to actually use the best methods in inventory management and queue management? And how do we figure out how to measure the things that are hard to measure, like all that stuff that's trying to hide from us? It's kind of like a whack-a-mole gang with the folks like the Coast Guard and everything, where they're trying to find drug runners. Where is measurement useful? When should we not even try for trends? How do we do smarter analysis? How do we look for the positive outliers that may have promising practices so we can replicate them, so we can test them and see if they're in fact effective? How do we look for patterns so that we know, hey, if this is all happening at between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., that I should actually pay attention to that? How do we tag our measurement with time and place and other attributes that are going to help us figure out smarter ways to deliver? How do we build performance alliances? So the Health and Human Services has created a partnership for patients where they're trying to reduce the hospital-acquired infections, where they're trying to reduce the number of returns to hospitals after you've been a patient within 30 days, and they've signed up thousands of healthcare providers. How do we make these alliances work? How do we do smarter audience-focused communication? I showed you performance.gov. Clearly, we got to work on that. It's not clear, though, that the audience there, in some ways, is not really this general public. Who's going to pay attention to that? We were using it to try and get people to change their practice within government. This was laying out a framework and trying to communicate that framework to folks within government. But if nobody pays attention to that at all, then will that be a good motivator for people within government? How do we do that? How about if each of you adopt a goal? Adopt one of those goals on there, and you'll see there's a feedback button. Adopt it and help us figure out how to do this smarter. Would that work? Those are some of the challenges, and how do we get those incentives? I'm back to the first question, for good government. In this fiscal climate, it's more essential than ever that we manage smarter and in a more transparent way so that we, the people, can support government. We can have this government of the people, by the people, and for the people that delivers smarter, more effective, more responsive, more transparent government. Those are the challenges I think that we faced. We've made progress. We ought to celebrate it, and we have work ahead of us. So I now really look forward to turning this over and hearing from the experts about how they're going to take the next steps. Thank you.
Working? Yes. Thanks so much, Shirley. I would just say that those of us on the Wood Committee try very hard every year to keep Bob Wood's legacy in mind, and we keep checking back with Peggy. And we try to have an event every year that is serious and deals with significant issues in his spirit. And I think we've been pretty successful, but I think this year Shirley might have moved us up a notch. It was really terrific. Thank you, Shirley. I'm Bob Turner. It's my pleasure to chair the Wood Committee. My day job is senior advisor to Commonwealth Compact, the statewide diversity initiative started by McCormack's founding dean, Steve Crosby, who's here, and continued with great energy by Dean Jackson. In a former life, I worked for many years at the Boston Globe. My editor was the great Tom Winship, some of you knew, a man a man who loved to collect people whom he thought of as being as lively as he, only smarter. Bob and Peggy Wood were one of his favorite couples. It's been a joy to work with Peggy and the family on this annual event, and I look forward to many more. And I also want to tip my hat just for a moment to Connie Chan, who stuck her head into one of our meetings a few months ago and was the one who actually suggested Shelley would be a great choice for the Wood Professorship this year. My assignment this evening is to introduce our panel members and to moderate a discussion among them and Shelley, and then to draw on questions from the audience. I've encouraged the panelists, and say the same to the audience, to make their comments or questions succinct so we can build on each other's ideas and have a real discussion. Let me ask the panel to come up now. Whoop. Short biographies of each of the panelists are in your program, and I will not repeat them. But as Shelley has suggested, we are very fortunate to have a very high-level group that can respond seriously to the serious points that Shelley has raised. Two of our panelists are everyday government practitioners. Who but an elected chief executive is better positioned to discuss these issues? We are extraordinarily lucky that Bob and Peggy's daughter, New Hampshire Governor Maggie Hassan, has found time to join us this evening. Thank you, Maggie. Ron Marlowe toils 24/7, it seems, in the Massachusetts Office of Administration and Finance, so is also a daily practitioner. We also have two persons with a strong academic view. McCormack's own Associate Professor of Public Policy, Michael Johnson, and Ron Marlowe, who is also 24/7, it seems, a PhD student here at the McCormack School. Our final panelist is my longtime Globe colleague, Peter Canellis, former Washington Bureau Chief, columnist, and now editor of the editorial page at the Globe. So again, keep it short, questions, comments, and let's have a real discussion. Let's get going. Professor.
Well, thank you. Good evening. Dr. Metzenbaum, Shelley, thank you very much for your thoughtful and detailed comments. You've described innovative strategies by the federal government to ensure that performance management is not just a technical exercise in counting and cataloging, but is a means to a larger and more fundamental end of making government more effective and accountable, as well as more efficient. Before I get into the body of my remarks, I should tell you Ira Jackson wanted me to remind the audience that Bill Bratton, former New York City Chief of Police, City of Boston Chief of Police, Los Angeles Chief of Police, and MBTA, is a UMass Boston graduate.
That's right.
And an FOI. That's a friend of Ira. So what I take away from Shelley's talk is even more profound. The goal of making government more effective and accountable is yet another means to a more fundamental goal, increasing citizens' trust in government. With this reservoir of trust, government has the freedom, with the associated responsibility, of setting ambitious goals, defining performance benchmarks that are tangible and achievable, and providing government the space to address the long game and shorter-term concerns simultaneously. Let me examine these insights in more detail. By setting ambitious goals that are aligned with the core values of our people and of the Republic, government communicates to citizens that it wishes to do the hard work that will form a more perfect union. By defining performance benchmarks that are tangible and achievable, government enables citizens to better understand, evaluate, and provide feedback on government performance. By focusing on long-term as well as shorter-term concerns, government gains the freedom and flexibility to do what I might call intelligent experimentation, understanding that some strategies and policy initiatives may work better than others. But one way to think about Shelley's comments is to remind ourselves of the frequent disconnect between policy, politics, and operations. I think of politics as the art and practice of gaining and using power, responding to and influencing public opinion to do so. In contrast, policy is concerned with evaluating the efficacy of past and current actions and prescriptions of public actors, and crafting guidelines and recommendations regarding future actions. Finally, operations is focused on specific actions, rules, and incentives that are intended to implement policy goals and to evaluate the quality and impact of current actions. There's another lens that we can use to evaluate Dr. Metzenbaum's comments, and this is through the lens of management science and policy science. So in my work, I rely on the notion of value structuring to achieve two goals. The first is to help stakeholders better understand what they want to achieve by articulating fundamental objectives and the criteria by which they can be measured. The second is to help stakeholders understand how these goals might be achieved by identifying ends objectives, those that help achieve these more basic goals, and policy alternatives which can support various objectives. So a clear understanding of values can provide strong support for decision models and applications that can address strategy, tactics, as well as operations. Analytics describes ways that raw material of data can be organized and transformed into evidence and outcome measures which constitute information and knowledge. Public policy analysis can provide support for analytic methods and decision models and ensure that this work is appropriate and feasible. So the challenge, as I see it, of Dr. Metzenbaum's work is to create workable linkages between policy and operations and between analytics and politics. Dr. Metzenbaum's work acknowledges the constraints and imperatives of politics that can make bad policies irresistible, while making good policies impossible to implement. More importantly, her work has the potential to build support among progressively better informed citizens for policies and practices that can help government be a positive force for good, reflecting and benefiting the broadest diversity of our population. So I thank Shirley Metzenbaum. I think her comments have made a strong case that the sorts of linkages I have described can be and are being forged in creative ways that are grounded in core values. I hope that the initiatives that she describes will be as effective and long-lived as I think they deserve to be. I thank you again, Shirley, for your presence tonight and your service on behalf of public policy, public administration, and public management. Thank you.
No, I was just
Well, I'll add my thanks, Shelley. That was great, and I was taking notes because I am a governor who ran on a platform of making sure that we would move forward with innovation efforts in our state. In a state, for those of you who study politics and government, where the ability to do anything in a very centralized way is particularly challenging and particularly wonderful. I love my state. I love our structure of government. But for those of you who don't know, we have 1.3 million people in New Hampshire with a House of Representatives that numbers 400 and a Senate that numbers 24. So the House is in theory too big and the Senate is in theory too small, gets overwhelmed by the number of bills that the House sends over. We are the largest state government in the country. We are, in fact, either the third or fourth largest legislative body in the free world. And we pay our legislators $100 a year. That's set in the Constitution from 1887. We have the smallest staff in the country for our legislature and state government. But we work. We also have a system. I do not appoint my own cabinet. Commissioners head our departments, and they all have commissions that are longer than the governor's 2-year term. And you can only remove a commissioner by really proving in a trial that they are incompetent or malfeasant in some way. Add to that that we have, other governors are so glad they're not me when I tell them this, but it's really interesting, and it works. But we also have a 5-person executive council, and while Massachusetts has a kind of vestigial organization of an executive council that approves or is involved in judicial nominations, I can nominate my commissioners when their terms are up, and I can nominate judges, but I cannot appoint them without a majority vote of our 5-person elected executive council. And our executive council approves all contracts that the state enters into worth more than $10,000. Wow. So I listen to, yeah, I listen, so this is a bottom-up state, and it is a state where the art of persuasion and collaboration and consensus building is essential. And 40% of our voters are independents, and 30% are Democrats, and 30% are Republicans. So we've got kind of the perfect storm here to try out what Shelley is talking about. And I think I signed my executive order for an innovation commission today. Or maybe I've just seen a draft, but it will be coming out soon. But what I do think is important in a state like mine, where we have 2-year terms, so you're always trying to figure out how do you do performance metrics while also running for re-election. And in New Hampshire, everybody runs every 2 years, except for our United States senators. But I think in addition to trying to figure out kind of the logistics of this, how do you instruct a commissioner you didn't appoint and may not be a fan? I'm lucky I went after another terrific Democratic governor who was a friend, and many of his commissioners I know and have worked with. So there are logistical challenges that I think about when I listen to your presentation, but what I think is really critical to take away is something that Michael just got at. First of all, there is a constant debate in our society about whether in James Madison's design we truly are a government of the people, where the government only has as much power as the people decides it's going to have. So is government us, or is government some sort of foreign separate entity that is separated from us and can impose on us? And when you have performance metrics, you begin to be able to engage in self-government and give people the confidence, as Michael was talking about, and the trust to perhaps believe, in fact, that it is us and that we shouldn't be scared of the decisions we make, because just as we can give some power to government, if it doesn't work, we can pull it back. So that's one of the very important takeaways, I think, from the work that you and your colleagues are doing. The other thing is, 2 other things. One is that it moves us from a political debate in which we see government as a test of ideologies, competing ideologies, into a place where we can begin to get back at what I think our founders wanted us to do, which is see government as a problem-solving entity that makes progress with every generation, we hope, and when it doesn't, reevaluates and moves on, so that we can move away from some of the partisan ideological gridlock, because you can't worry more about winning the argument than you can about solving the problem, and that's what metrics can get you to. And finally, I think that the interesting challenge when you talked about incentives and rewards is, of course, that government, unlike private business, really can't afford ever to fail. And that's, that's one of the essential things Dad always talked about. And I'm not saying that when a business fails, it can wreak havoc with the people who are involved in the business, or the people who might be customers of the business, or the economy generally, depending on its role. But at essence, what we do in government is provide the foundation for everything else, not to mention care for our most vulnerable. And so we can't afford to fail. And that means that the way we figure out those incentives and those rewards is particularly important and particularly challenging, but I look forward to trying to do it. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I think I'll start with the phrase, especially since Shelley talked about our founding. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I think the story of our country has been an evolving quest to make that ideal be more real in practice than perhaps it was when the words were first spoken. And how does that connect to the quest of an effective, accountable, trusted government? I think that becomes the true test and question for us, because, of course, 2 of those elements were fully on display display both in Shelley's comments but also in Michael's comments, questions of effectiveness and questions of efficiency. Of course, we want our government to be more effective, and we want it to be more efficient. Some may say more businesslike. I very rarely say that phrase. But there is another E that we often don't talk enough about that I think lends itself to questions of accountability and trusted equally well, and that is the question of equity. Is our government, or does our government treat people in an equitable manner? Because as we all know, throughout our history, government at times has been either a silent enabler of unjust or inequitable treatment, or has been a passive participant in the exercise of fairness, equality, and fair play. And so one of the things that we try to do, it was mentioned that in the Patrick administration we have embraced the notion of performance management. We've tried to elevate questions of equity to be on par with questions of efficiency and effectiveness, because we understand and we embrace the notion that one measure of trusted and accountable government is, do we treat everyone fairly who wishes to work for state government? Do you have a fair and equitable opportunity to be an employee? If you own a business and you happen to be a minority-owned or woman-owned, do you have a fair opportunity to be a vendor to the Commonwealth? If, in fact, you are trying to access services and you are a limited English proficient individual, but you are otherwise ineligible for those services, does government respond effectively to meet you where you are so that your language barrier does not become a means for denying you access to those services? Equally important, when we promulgate regulations or other policies, do we think about the impacts, however unintentional they may be, that the implementation of those policies will have on different populations? If we are not thinking about those things, then as effective and as efficient as we might become, there will be an element of mistrust that exists among some among us, and there will be a question of accountability that remains not fully answered. So as we struggle through questions of accountable, trusted, effective government, let us take a global perspective on those questions to ensure that for each and every one of you, as you seek to answer that question in the affirmative, you can do so with full confidence, knowing that no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter what you do, that your government is truly reflective of your values and is responsive to your values. I think that becomes still one of the unending challenges that we have in government, because government, as you know, is very good at telling you what you should do and is not always so mindful of heeding its own advice. What we do in the Patrick administration is try to make sure that what we tell you to do, that we are trying to do it better and more effectively, and yes, oftentimes more efficiently, in executing that mission and that charge. And as I wrap up the brief opening, because I love Q&A a whole lot more than I love talking at you, I will leave you, with a phrase that if you ever get an email from me, you'll see at the bottom, because it animates the work that we try to do in the Patrick administration. Equity of opportunity is not the enemy of efficiency. It is the promise of our democratic governance. And every day we try to make that more real for you and for everyone else in the Commonwealth. So thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for including me, and thank you to the Wood family and to Dean Jackson and Bob and everybody else who's responsible for this great event. As a person who's a little bit outside of government, I want to make just 2 points that I think will try to answer some of what Shelley and Michael raised about how do you get this message out? How do you, create a constituency out there for effective, responsible government? The first is sort of an explanation for why some of those disconnects that Michael mentioned might exist, and that is that as much as we are in, when we look around and we look at who's in office right now, it feels like a Democratic era. We are still in some ways in the fourth decade of the Reagan administration when it comes to regarding the role of government and seeing the role of government. And I think that Democrats, while they've found a way to be successful, are somewhat responsible themselves for sending negative signals about government. And I can cite an example here in Massachusetts. Our governor, Governor Patrick, recently proposed, in what I think was a very bold attempt to kind of change the conversation here in Massachusetts, he proposed a $1.9 billion package of tax hikes with the idea that you would be trading these tax hikes for some very tangible rewards, for the building of a railroad system down to the South Coast, for the expansion of the Green Line out into Somerville, for major improvements in certain transportation functions, for putting the T on a sustainable footing for decades to come and encouraging transit-oriented development. Also for transforming early childhood education in a really significant way. And he wanted to have that conversation. The legislature, which is overwhelmingly Democrat, the most Democratic legislature in the country here in Massachusetts, and unlike New Hampshire, a very professional-rooted set of politicians who are thinking not only about re-election, but this is their career. It's a different character to some degree to the legislature, as you know, refused to do it and could bring themselves only in fear of a tax hike vote to commit themselves between 500 and 800 million, with the idea that they could go to their constituents and say that money is absolutely necessary just to no new stuff at all. But it's just to remedy some of the failures that we have in transportation, which included a lot of big dig mitigation stuff that got charged to the T and created a big deficit, and some ridiculous past practices like having regular officials be paid out of the capital budget. But essentially what these Democrats in the legislature were saying is they were saying that they would rather go to their constituents and say, look, we voted to raise your taxes, but we did it kicking and screaming. We did it because this transportation system is so messed up, and there was so many patchwork fixes in the past that government was just falling apart, and to provide you with the basic services we needed, we had to do this. It's a very negative message compared to saying we are voting to raise taxes, but we're doing it because we're going to have measurable results in early childhood education and in transportation, and we're going to create economic development opportunities. They believe that you can't go to the public and say, government is working, government's doing great stuff, this is what you're getting for your money, and that argument will stick. They just don't believe that will happen. My second thought, though, on a slightly more positive note of ways that the message could get out, and this is purely kind of speaking as a journalist, I wonder about the goal-setting process. What you described, I know you're from OMB, sounded a little bit like a personnel system similar to the one that we actually have in our company about goal setting, where individuals set their own goals and then are responsible for achieving them. But in areas like Indian affairs, having Indians play a role in setting the goal and having them play a rather public role in setting the goal, you might find that nobody wants to have a high crime rate, but maybe economic development is a higher priority or something like that. And with actual constituents out there saying, look, this worked for me, and with a public process that can be measured, but not only measured by numbers, but measured by visible, tangible progress with the local media involved and then potentially the national media beyond it, you can create more positive stories like that. So thank you. That's my perspective on that.
Response from Shirley while you're all honing your questions for 1 second.
And I have to say, listening to all of this, my brain is going, where there are opportunities, and Governor, I'm just feeling for you right now. At the same time, Ron, I love that you're adding the third E here. I think it is right on the money. And in fact, some of the goals we have are equity goals. But Peter, I want to pick up on yours just in terms of, I couldn't agree with you more that the goal setting needs to be not just a top-down or just a single person. And it is, in fact, when I say adopt a goal, I can tell you that I look at some of those goals and I push back as OMB, but then I'm OMB pushing back. And when I talk about adopt a goal and feedback, I'm trying to figure out how do we organize constituencies who can help actually think through smarter goals. There's great experience in Oregon and other places where they've got like Rotary clubs to adopt teen pregnancy goals, you know. And if you can't get somebody to adopt a goal, maybe you're not thinking about the right goals, or some of the longer term goals are kind of hard. And obviously, and the challenge here is if we actually get this goal setting to work well, then the folks who have the most to gain are going to try and game the goal setting system. That said, I think you're right. And what excited me was in the first round of goal setting, it was basically the agency setting it and negotiating it with OMB. In the second round, it was negotiating it with the entire White House policy apparatus. And in the third round, which is coming up between June and February 2014, the next set will be announced, I'm hoping we can actually engage the public. And agencies in their strategic planning that they're doing starting now are really trying to figure out how do we do that and how do we do that right. And I think that's right. And then I'll look back at Ron and just say, and Ron, and to the governor, let's figure out how to do this with state and locals. Because any goal that we share delivery with state and local governments, we ought to be having that conversation. Transportation's done that pretty well over the years. You know, they've actually worked with it, at least with the state transit officials. How do we do that? Transportation officials. How do we do that? Maybe with the governors, maybe with the A&F offices, maybe with the agency, with the state results offices. Let's figure that out.
This is fun. We are really on the move here and making some progress. Michael.
Okay. My question is motivated by an event that Michael and I put on a few weeks ago that featured the City of Boston's Office of New Urban Mechanics. And in my response to their comments, I noted that through this Urban Boston initiative, that I'd had a chance to go do some community meetings where people talked about the problems they saw in the neighborhoods and how to fix them. And stereotyping New Urban Mechanics as about apps, I noted that no meeting I had ever gone to had ordinary citizens saying, we want more apps. Right? So this motivates my question, which is, what do we know about what citizens say they want to know about how government works and how to make it better? Do they want more numbers, more spreadsheets, more apps?
What a great question. I'm not going to try and be an expert here and actually hope some academics might know the subject matter, but I guess I will say that you know, it's why I said when we looked at performance.gov, we don't think citizens want performance.gov. My wonderful sister sent me a note when I sent it out. It's up, it's live, we've got the first reporting, then I sent in March, we've got the first quarterly updates ever, it's really cool. She said, I love this, Shelley, this is just really great. I don't get it. You know, and I think that is for real. You know, I also remember a conversation with New York City. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at the New York City Mayor's Management Reports. New York City's been doing the Mayor's Management Reports. Where's Ira? Yeah, so it's like 1978 or something. When it went into default, right, is when they first started doing this. And they've done a remarkable job of really managing with measures. It started with New York City CompStat with the policing. Correction stat and park stat came next, and then Bloomberg came in and just sort of said, this is the way we do business. But the managers will say, oh, we don't care about the mayor's management report. That's just an irrelevant report. And yet it was very helpful to me in terms of giving us a model. I always used to use the public health one, where they were bringing down tobacco use rates. And that guy, by the way, is running the CDC now, Tom Frieden. But so I'm not sure we've got it right in terms of what do the citizens really want. At the same time, we do have some municipalities around the country, especially up in the upper Northwest, who are actually asking citizens what they want. I think what they want is good service when they have these interactions. And this goals and measurement and data, it's kind of like a company. The investors look at the annual reports and all that. The citizens and we as customers, we just want the products when we want it, and we want them to take care of us. And I think that is actually, though, you're picking up on something here, Michael, in that part of the problem with the way we used to run performance measurement and management was it was about the reports. And instead it is, what do our citizens want? Are we delivering the right stuff? And should we stop doing some stuff? And how do we get the diagnostic data that helps us answer those questions. I think we're just taking baby steps on that one, but I think we're all sort of starting to think through, how do we do that?
Governor.
I should mention one other thing. Toronto is taking a look at its 311 stuff and actually mining the data to look at the kinds of questions that are coming in, and that may be the most rich for us.
Governor.
What I think may be missing in what my question is about is the connection between what do people want and what kind of investment are they making, with the context of 4 years on Senate Finance, where everybody coming in and asking for funding said, if you invest this now, it'll pay off later. How do we connect the amount of investment with the outcome for citizens? Because it isn't just the outcomes. Is it worth the taxes?
So I wish I had a simple answer to that. I'm going to give my answer and know that other people have other answers, and so maybe Bob, others have some thoughts. One of the things that I've seen happen is, in the Bush administration, they pushed for efficiency measures in reporting, and they wanted efficiency measures for everybody. So every agency had to come up with efficiency measures. It didn't improve efficiency. What we're trying to do is to get you to sort of say, let's take housing and urban development. Housing and urban development knows how many people it was housing with its available funding. They set a goal to increase the number of people that they were housing with their available funds. And that forced them to actually, what it did was it got them looking at the vacancy and occupancy rate, and they pushed to get a higher occupancy rate. I think we're in better shape going that direction, where we're actually having the conversations around the goals and saying, okay, let's figure out what it costs to deliver, and then is there a lower cost way, or can we get more for that same amount of money? I really worry when we both go to efficiency measures, except for certain things like production operations where it's very similar and easily measured and you can have a per unit cost. And I also worry, and there is a lot of debate about people trying to do accounting where they're doing this, everything's going to do, I don't know the right term, full cost accounting or whatever, but you have to make assumptions about overhead rates.
Right.
And what those assumptions are can make all the difference in the world, and you can end up with some pretty stupid conclusions and decisions. So that's why I kind of prefer managing to reduce the costs, but I know that's not very satisfying to the general public and to the legislators.
Thanks, Shelley. Ron, quickie.
Sure. My question is somewhat related to the scenario that Peter outlined, but the governor's comment. How do you use what you're doing in performance management to help craft a narrative around effective, trusted, accountable, or do you not worry about that and leave that to someone else to be the messenger, if you will?
I worry about that a lot. But taking Peter's point to heart, I mean, it's hard to have that conversation when you're inside government, especially at the federal level. And yet it undergirds this whole, there is a hypothesis or a theory of the case here, depending on whether I'm an academic or a consultant, right? Is that if you are more open and if you start about what you're trying to do, you invite that debate about whether we've got the goals right, whether we've got the strategies right, and you're open about when you're having problems, what you're doing about them, like the interior goal where they didn't meet their goal, that you'll build trust. But I don't think it's enough, which is why my first question, and Peter, you framed it as, how do you build a constituency? How do we create market mechanisms that will actually push so that people pay attention and then start to say, I'm willing to pay more. I do have higher trust. And I don't have the answer to that question. I think that's a question we all need to figure out. Because if we don't, the alternatives ain't so good.
Peter.
Yeah. My one-sentence question would be for Governor Hassan. The New Hampshire Democrats have been successful at presenting themselves as pragmatists against an ideological Republican Party. What would your advice be nationally, and how can you incorporate into that sort of pragmatic dialogue, the idea of a results-oriented government?
I guess my response to that would be a very New Hampshire response, which is it's about the people. And I am in a state that is driven by a citizen legislature where 424 people earning $100 a year go to our state house. A bit of bragging rights, it's the longest continuously used state house in the United States of America. Those chambers have been used since 1819. And average citizens in our state show up at hearings. They also stop you in the gym, at the grocery store, in the parking lot, because you know, if you're a legislator, you have a license plate that identifies you. You get free tolls with your $100 and mileage. But all joking aside, average citizens show up for hearings and participate in them because, in their experience, the New Hampshire legislature listens to them and processes what input they get and actually changes policy as a result in a very transparent way. Because we are also a state in which no committee chair can keep a bill from being heard. Every bill filed goes to a hearing and must be heard, and even if it is killed by the committee, goes to the floor of the House or the Senate for a full, transparent vote that is noticed at least 3 days ahead of time. That means it is cumbersome as heck, and the workload, especially in the state Senate, can be extraordinary for $100 a year. But we are still a place in which citizens engage and speak up. They do it at all different levels of government. And so when you can engage with them and identify a problem, identify an outcome you want to have, you can show them that the ball can move forward. And we know each other well enough to see it moving forward. And so part of my answer is to focus on what it is, you know, the problem we want to solve, get people to engage and remember that there are goals that we all share. But I have to say that I recognize that I can do that at a level in New Hampshire, partly because of the transparency that we have and the degree to which we know each other, that I think is much harder nationally. The lack of citizen-to-citizen trust, it's just hard to think the worst of your neighbors when they're your neighbors in a small state where everybody engages. So it's not a very satisfactory answer, except to remember that you have got to get people engaged and you have got to listen to what they want. And in New Hampshire, for Democrats in particular, that also means hearing loud and clear that they don't want an income or sales tax and that they want us to do this in a different way. And that's a charge Democrats have to take seriously. And it's one of the things that makes it work for us.
Well, this has been a fabulous panel. Time is a little short, but we do have a nice chunk of time here, and I want to get as many questions and responses from Shirley and the panel as possible. People have some questions. I know this is a fabulous audience. Go.
Thank you. Hi, great panel. It's great to see Maggie here as someone who worked with Bob Wood for many years when he was superintendent of the Boston Public Schools and after. My question has to do with the use of digital technology as a form of engagement, not just citizens, but also this panel I know has been all about government. I spend all my time, A, in the digital world, it seems, and B, working on how the private sector and institutional investors can be more accountable to the public interest. So the question has two branches. One, the use of digital technology, and two, the ways in which partnerships with the private sector and civil society might help advance some of these public policy objectives.
Two pretty big questions. Can we get brief answers?
So in both cases, I think there's enormous possibility. You know, if you look even in the traffic fatalities, there's been huge public-private partnerships over the years. We're trying to do it on hospital-acquired infections and all of that. And the data mining that's happening is enormous. I mentioned earlier today that Health and Human Services has done data paloozas to try and get the private sector engaged in solutions using the data that will help people, picking problems they'll focus on. So I think we're on the cusp of this exciting revolution. And I think if we can start to articulate what are the issues we care about in a two-way communication, not a one government out, but two-way, it's enormous. The possibilities are enormous. And if government's not doing it, we've seen it. You know, the citizens actually, the Obama administration has something where we identify, you know, agenda items. And we've had so much citizen input, you know, we keep changing the threshold because we can't take it all on. But I think we're on the cusp of a real revolution that's enormously exciting.
Just real quick to your point, in Massachusetts we do have a chief government innovation officer now. His name is Tony. I'm blanking on his last name. Oh my God! And he's a colleague. Yes, Tony the Geek. And we do have an innovation council because the governor has recognized that digital is a way to actually better involve citizens in helping us solve certain problems and working with the private sector. Now, of course, whenever we say that, there are two other challenges. We always have to be mindful of whatever we're looking to implement, is it accessible, especially to people with disabilities? Because as you know, much software is not fully accessible, but we have a commitment to trying to make sure anything we implement that everyone can utilize. And then second, Massachusetts, probably not unlike many states, has somewhat arcane, at times, procurement laws that may frustrate the ability for the private sector to work with us as fully as the private sector would like, because we have to make sure that we protect them on the back end should we go to implement something and there's a vendor out there looking to utilize whatever's been brought to the table. So, but Tony will lead us through that process.
Thanks, Ron. And
I'd like to respond.
Briefly, we want to get as many people involved as possible,
yes,
Mike.
Digital technology. There are lots of opportunities to use digital technology. I'm not a Facebooker, but my wife is, and I know that there are ways to get people tapping and clicking. But we already heard from Shirley that people aren't looking for dashboards. They aren't looking for lots of numbers. And I don't think complaint forums are the way to engage people either. I think the literature on the democratic forums where people are provided with curated information that allows them to do structured deliberation may produce the citizens who can participate via smartphone, but maybe in more than 140 character chunks.
And here's Christine, who I'm betting has one question.
So we talk about 311, and New York City uses it, and Baltimore uses it effectively. It's a direct voice from the citizen, the potholes in front of my house. At the federal level, we don't really have an exact equivalent, but I would like you to talk about the direct access at the federal level, and then what about lobbying, and what about interest groups, and how does that tie in with direct access at the federal level? Thank you.
So I think, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, to tell the truth. We are definitely trying to look at all of our call centers and everything and figure out how to run them more effectively and pull the data from them so that we see what the questions are. We get better answered, more focused answers. We don't do a lot of direct service delivery. State and local governments, contractors, those are huge constituents if you actually look at the folks we touch, except in the veteran space and those who receive direct benefits from us. But in those cases, I mean, our call centers, we actually get, customer service. We compare extremely well on many of those to the private sector. Now, your other question in terms of lobbying, I'm not sure where to take that question, except that it's a reality, and we've tried with our regulatory work and everything to open government, and really get the information that's coming in out to others and figure out how to process it. Again, I think we have a long way to go, and trying to figure out how you get organized constituencies balanced by disorganized constituencies. But again, I think that's an area where the digital world is actually making it lower cost to organize those who have small gains compared to the way it's been in the past. So I think there's huge new opportunities that people are beginning to understand how to sort of tap and respond.
Marty Exaferis.
Hi, Shelley. How are you? Good to see you. I'm over here.
There you are, Marty.
How are you? Came to see you and others. The last week has been traumatic for everyone, but I would like to turn it positive because there are so many things that we saw that give knowledge and inspiration to us. For me, it was the clapping when the police cruisers and the ambulance removed from Watertown. A stunning thing, much like you see in an airport now when a unit of soldiers will get off and all the folks sitting waiting for their planes will stand up. So that was. Secondly, there was just announced today $20 million in the Boston First or the One Boston Fund, just an enormous surge. Third, social media, the critical importance and the prevalence of the dominance even of social media. I did get a kick when Tommy was tweeting. That was unusual to have Mayor Menino tweeting. But the fourth thing was, and this is what relates to the panel, was with some of the leaders, in fact, many of the leaders spoke in terms of, and Obama does this a lot, teaching moments. And they didn't talk about, we saw today on display the efficiency of the government. They talked about, we saw today the people that you hired on to protect you, working on your behalf. And somehow we have to take from the whole experience learning opportunities, how to communicate better, how to do it. Any thoughts on that sort of rambling observation?
So I mean, Marty, I think very thoughtful. What we learned last week was we should be optimistic. I mean, it's like people are out there and they want to help. They really want to make a difference. They do trust their government. And it's when you have specific problems and you rally folks around it. So I call it a goal, but it's problem solving. It's opportunity pursuing. And it's connecting people to the problems and the places and connecting people in government so they talk about it that way. You're right. Nobody wants to talk about efficiency, effectiveness, or even equity. People feel it and they want the problems fixed. And I think that's the trick, is to figure out how to get folks to say, I'm going to deal with this space or this group of, this problem, and let's get that fixed. And let's use the new media, et cetera. The data and all those data-driven discussions I'm talking about, that's a means to an end. We just got to learn how to do it. And I think part of the challenge is for those who do work in government, allowing them, inviting them, giving them the freedom to take on a problem and to really wrestle with it. And when you do that, instead of giving them sort of assignments that are bureaucratic, when you let them connect to the problems and the people, you get amazing things happening. And I think that's the challenge. Whether it becomes viral, so how do we create this virtuous cycle? How do we get this viral goodness so that people see what happened last week is actually something that is spreading? I'm not sure how to figure that out. I'm optimistic we can, especially with the new media. What happened last week in terms of the way we use the media to engage people in solving problems was miraculous. It was just remarkable. That's the challenge. I'm optimistic we can figure it out. I'm not sure it'll get labeled, but I'm optimistic we can keep pushing it. How we get it, back to Peter's thing, to get people willing to pay the cost of delivery. That's, I think, one of our biggest challenges.
I want to finish on time, and we are very short, but I think we have time for one more very brief question and answer.
Thank you, Shelley. Great talk. I'd like to shift the focus from digital, virtual media to face-to-face encounters. In the work that we've done across the country in low-income communities, we learn from people that the moment at which they enter democratic terrain, which is actually public institutions, agencies, services, is where they feel that their voice doesn't count. where they don't participate. In fact, there was a welfare recipient in New Hampshire who told us it's kind of at the welfare office, it's where I learned that my voice doesn't count. And working with folks there, they learned that there were opportunities to voice their opinions. But it seems to me that one role for government is to look at how to set criteria for how interactions happen at that micro level, so that there's expectations that when I walk into the welfare office or my children's school, that I can know why reasons for a decision, the process for making it, and the role that I can play for it. So I'd like to kind of move away from what's the digital solution to look at what's the infrastructure solution to turn those institutions into democratic institutions where people can have experiences that are democratic.
Yeah, so I don't know if anyone else wants to take a crack at that. I mean, you know, for me, I think one of the challenges, and I use this awful term, outcomes-based government, but what it really is connecting the people in government to the people who in our communities, and not creating these divides that we've done, so that there's real face-to-face communication or face-to-face understanding of what the problems are that they're addressing. So, and that, you know, when people ask, what are we trying to do? It's improving those outcomes. So if it is a welfare mother, her problem isn't being on welfare or not being on welfare. It is worrying about her kids and their ability to thrive, and how do we work with the folks we're trying to help to figure out what their issues are and deliver on that, which means crossing divides. And it's not easy. I think it's possible, but it's not easy. But we need to do that. We need to get focused on what are the real problems we're trying to do, or what are the opportunities we're trying to pursue, and then give the people in government some flexibility to be able to deliver on it. Ron talked about the complexity of the contracting. It ain't easy. And you've got a part of this is also energizing, giving the folks in government the energy to know that they can think and apply apply their brains to come up with solutions.
I think Governor Hassan has a quick comment.
You go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No. Oh, okay. I would get back to my dad's fairly common comment in our household, which is that there's a difference between charity and justice. And the reminder to our fellow citizens and people who work in government that the person who needs welfare today is not to be seen just as somebody we have to provide services to because he or she happens to be a single parent of children, and even if that person has failed in their adult role, the children need taken care of. And instead see our work as this ongoing process of bringing people in from the margins, not because it's a nice thing to do, but because our mission as a country and as a state is to unleash the talent and energy of every single person. The idea, of course, that we could be both a self-governing people and a people that would become a dominant economic power was a completely revolutionary and crazy one 237 years ago. And what we have done generation by generation is prove our forefathers right by beginning to understand that each and every person is truly equal in our society. We are incredibly imperfect at it still. I like to think we are better at it than we were 237 years ago. But I do think that that's part of what we have to be able to engage each other about.
Peter, real quick.
That's too good an ending for the. We'll take it up later.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I just want to say I think that Shelley was so appropriate in quoting the Founding Fathers as she began, because I think what we've talked about for the last 2 hours are the most fundamental issues in a democracy: the relationship of the people to the government, which is themselves writ large if things are working right, but not always the case. And how that's going to work out in the future is just it couldn't be a more core issue, one that I know Bob Wood would have loved to have been here today. Lots of interesting ideas raised, lots of different possibilities raised, lots of different things to pursue. Sorry we weren't able to get in all the questions here. But I think together it was a very rich 2 hours, and I hope together we have done a little bit for freedom today.
Thank you.
Thank you.